Sei Shōnagon, Makura no Soshi, The Pillow Book, Chapter 121. The Chancellor's Pilgrimage to Kamo. The Special Festival at Kamo. On one cold, overcast day, the snow began to come down in scattered flakes, falling on the blue and white robes of the people in the procession, and on the flowers that they wore in their head dress. I found the sight immensely delightful. The sheaths of the dancers' swords shone magnificently, and the cords of their jackets, which hung over the sheaths, were so bright that they might have been polished. Beneath the printed material of their trouser skirts, I could see the brilliant, glossy silk of their under robes, and for a moment I wondered whether they were made of ice. I was relishing the beauty of the procession when the envoys appeared. They were certainly a most undistinguished lot, having been chosen from among provincial governors, and the like common-looking men not worth one's attention. Yet so long as their faces were hidden by the sprays of wisteria in their head dress, it was not too unpleasant to see them go by. While we were still watching the dancers, the musicians appeared, wearing willow-colored robes and yellow roses in their head dress. They were insignificant men of low rank, but it was delightful to hear them chanting, "The princess pines that grow outside all powerful Kamo shrine," and beating the measure very loudly with their fans. What can compare with an imperial progress? When the emperor passes in his palanquin, he is as impressive as a god, and I forget that my work in the palace constantly brings me into his presence. Not only His Majesty himself, but even people like ladies of the escort, who usually are of no importance, overawe me when I see them in an imperial progress. I particularly enjoy watching the assistant directors of the Bureau of Imperial Attendants as they walk past holding the cords of the imperial palanquin, and also the captains of the inner palace guards, who serve as its escorts. The return procession of the High Priestess from Kamo is a magnificent sight. I recall one year when everything was especially beautiful. On the day of the festival itself, we had stopped our carriage on that splendidly wide road, the First Avenue, and had sat there for a long time, hiding our faces behind our fans and waiting for the procession to arrive. A hot sun shone through the carriage blinds, dazzling us and making us perspire in a most unsightly fashion. On the following day, we set out very early to see the High Priestess's procession. Though the sun had risen, the sky was overcast. As we reached the gates of Urin and Chisoku temples, we noticed a number of carriages decorated with branches of faded hollyhock and maple. We could hear a loud chorus of Hatadajisu. This was the bird whose song so fascinated me that I would lie awake at night waiting for it. I was just thinking how delightful it was that I could now hear great numbers of these birds without making the slightest effort when Uneasy joined in with his rather croaky voice. He sounded as if he were trying to imitate the beautiful song of the Hatadajisu, and I found this unpleasant, though at the same time rather amusing. While we sat in our carriage waiting impatiently for the procession, we saw a group of men in red coming from the upper shrine. "What's happening? Is the procession on its way?" we asked them, but they replied that they had no idea and continued down the road, carrying the High Priestess's empty palanquins. It impressed me deeply that the High Priestess herself had traveled in one of these palanquins, but I was rather disturbed at the thought that low fellows like these could have come close to her sacred presence. Though we had been told that there might be a long wait, the High Priestess and her retinue soon arrived from the upper shrine. First, we could see the fans come into sight, then the yellow-green robes of the gentlemen from the Emperor's private office. It was a splendid sight. The men wore their robes in such a way that the white material stood out against the yellowish green of their outer robes, and I was reminded so much of white hana blossoms in a green hedge that I almost expected to find a Hatadajisu lurking there. On the previous day, I had noticed several of these young noblemen crowded together in a carriage. They had taken down the blinds and I could see that they were messily dressed in hunting costumes and violet cloaks. Altogether, they had made a very bizarre impression. Today, these same young men were beautifully attired in full court costume and ready to take part in the High Priestess's banquet, to which they had been invited as extra guests. They looked extremely demure as one by one they passed, each in his own carriage, and the young palace pages who followed were also very attractive. After the procession had gone, things got out of hand. Everyone wanted to be the first to leave, and there was a great crush of carriages, which I found rather frightening. I stuck my fan out of the window to summon my attendants. "Don't be in such a hurry," I scolded them. "Go slowly." Since they paid not the slightest attention and continued to push ahead, I became very flustered and ordered them to pull up the carriage in a place where the road was a little wider. The men were very impatient, and it annoyed them to have to stop. I enjoyed watching the carriages as they hurried along the road, each one trying to forge ahead of another. I allowed them all to get a good start before letting my men continue. It was a delightful road, rather like the paths that lead up to mountain villages. The thick hedges on both sides looked rough and shaggy. They were covered with hana, but the flowers had not yet come into bloom. I told my men to break off some of the branches and stuck them here and there in the carriage. They looked very pretty, all the more so since the decorations of maple and hollyhock had unfortunately begun to fade. When I had glanced down the road from the distance, it had seemed impossible that all the carriages would get through. But now, as we gradually advanced, I was pleased to see it was not as crowded as I had thought. I noticed that the carriage of one man, I have no idea who he can have been, was following close behind mine, and I decided that this was much more pleasant than being alone on the road. When we came to a fork where our paths separated, he leaned out and recited the line, "That scatter on the peak," which I found delightful. Sei Shōnagon, Makura no Soshi, The Pillow Book, Chapter 122. In the 5th month, I love going up to a mountain village. When one passes a marsh on the way, a thick covering of weeds hides the water, and it seems like a stretch of green grass. But as the escort walk across these patches, the water spurts up under their feet, though it is quite shallow. The water is incredibly clear and looks very pretty as it gushes forth. Where the road runs between hedges, a branch will sometimes thrust its way into the carriage. One snatches at it quickly, hoping to break it off. Alas, it always slips out of one's hand. Sometimes one's carriage will pass over a branch of sagebrush, which then gets caught in the wheel and is lifted up at each turn, letting the passengers breathe its delicious scent. Sei Shōnagon, Makura no Soshi, The Pillow Book, Chapter 123. During the hot months, it is a great delight to sit on the veranda, enjoying the cool of the evening and observing how the outlines of objects gradually become blurred. At such a moment, I particularly enjoy the sight of a gentleman's carriage, preceded by outriders clearing the way. Sometimes a couple of commoners will pass in a carriage, with the rear blinds slightly raised. As the oxen trot along, one has a pleasant sense of freshness. It is still more delightful when the sound of a lute or flute comes from inside the carriage, and one feels sorry when it disappears in the distance. Occasionally one catches a whiff of the oxen's leather cruppers. It is a strange, unfamiliar smell, but absurd as it may seem, I find something rather pleasant about it. On a very dark night, it is delightful when the aroma of smoke from the pine, torches at the head of a procession is wafted through the air and pervades the carriage in which one is traveling. Sei Shōnagon, Makura no Soshi, The Pillow Book, Chapter 124. One has carefully scented a robe and then forgotten about it for several days. When finally one comes to wear it, the aroma is even more delicious than on freshly scented clothes. Sei Shōnagon, Makura no Soshi, The Pillow Book, Chapter 125. When crossing a river in bright moonlight, I love to see the water scatter in showers of crystal under the oxen's feet. Sei Shōnagon, Makura no Soshi, The Pillow Book, Chapter 126. Priests, fruit, houses, provision bags, ink sticks for ink stones. Men's eyes, when they are too narrow, they look feminine. On the other hand, if they were as large as metal bowls, I should find them rather frightening. Round braziers, winter cherries, pine trees, the petals of yellow roses. Horses, as well as oxen, should be large. Sei Shōnagon, Makura no Soshi, The Pillow Book, Chapter 127. A piece of thread when one wants to sew something in a hurry. A lampstand. The hair of a woman of the lower classes should be neat and short. The speech of a young girl. Sei Shōnagon, Makura no Soshi, The Pillow Book, Chapter 128. Nothing annoys me so much as someone who arrives at a ceremony in a shabby, poorly decorated carriage. It is not so bad if the person has come to hear a sermon with the aim of clearing himself of sin, but even then, a very inelegant carriage is bound to make a bad effect. At the Kamo festival, of course, such negligence is quite inexcusable. Yet there are people who actually attend the ceremony in carriages where plain white robes have been hung up instead of the proper blinds. Even when one has carefully equipped one's carriage in honor of the great day, making sure that the blinds and other fittings are exactly right, and has set out for the ceremony confident that one presents a fairly elegant appearance to the world, it is most unpleasant to see a near-by carriage that is superior to one's own, and one wonders why it had to appear at just that place. How much more galling must it be for someone who is traveling in a really shabby carriage? At the time of the festival, when the carriages of the young noblemen go up and down the avenue, it really makes one's heart pound with excitement if one of them pushes its way between the others and stops close to one's own. I remember one year when, wishing to be sure of a good view, I hurried my servants and set out early in the morning. As a result, I had to wait a long time for the procession to arrive. The suffocating heat added to my impatience, and I moved about restlessly in my carriage. I was just standing up to stretch myself when I saw a group of about 8 carriages moving quickly along the avenue, one directly behind the other. They came from the direction of the high priestess's palace, and the passengers were senior courtiers, assistant officials of the emperor's private office, controllers, minor counselors, and other gentlemen who were to attend the high priestess's banquet as extra guests. It was a delightful surprise to find that things had already started. The senior courtiers ordered that dishes of watered rice be served to some of the more distinguished outriders at the head of the procession. Servants came down to the galleries and held the horses by the bridles. Then those of the outriders, whose fathers were important men, partook of the watered rice. It was a pleasant scene, but I felt rather sorry for the lesser riders. When the high priestess's palanquin was carried along the avenue, I enjoyed seeing how all the people pulled down the blinds of their carriages, hastily raising them as soon as the high priestess had passed. Now a carriage came and stood directly in front of mine. I complained bitterly, but the attendants paid no attention and simply said, "Why shouldn't we stay here?" Not knowing how to argue with such men, I sent a message to the owner of the carriage. It was really rather an amusing situation. Although the carriages were already squeezed together tightly, new ones kept arriving. The passengers were people of high rank, accompanied by numerous attendants who traveled in carriages behind them. I was wondering how they could possibly find room when I saw the outriders leap off their horses and briskly force the other carriages to move back. I was most impressed by the way in which they managed to get their masters, carriages, and then those of the attendants into the spaces that had been cleared. But it was rather pathetic to observe the owners of the simple carriages as they harnessed their oxen and jogged along, looking for some new place. The grander carriages, of course, could not be treated in such a cavalier fashion. Though there were many splendid carriages in the crowd, I also noticed quite a few that had an ugly, rustic look and whose humble occupants were forever summoning their servants and giving them their babies to hold. Sei Shōnagon, Makura no Soshi, The Pillow Book, Chapter 129. There was a man in the corridor early this morning who had no business to be here. I heard one of the ladies in waiting say. His servant was holding an umbrella over him when he left. I was listening to her story with interest when suddenly I realized that she was talking about a visitor of mine. He was admittedly a gentleman of rather low rank, but he was perfectly acceptable, and there was no reason why I should not receive him. I was still feeling rather put out when a letter came from Her Majesty, with a message that I was to reply at once. Opening it in great excitement, I found a drawing of a large umbrella. One could see nothing of the person underneath, except the fingers round the handle. Below were written the words, "Since dawn first shed its light over Mount Mikasa's peak." Knowing that the Empress attached the greatest importance to our behavior even in very trivial affairs, I had been hoping that no one would tell her about this somewhat embarrassing and disagreeable incident. Now I realized that she had in fact heard the rumor. I was dismayed, yet at the same time amused, and taking another piece of paper, I drew a picture of rain falling heavily and wrote underneath, "My name, though innocent of rain, has long been spattered by unfounded tales. So it must all be a matter of wet clothes," I added, and sent the message to the Empress, who laughingly told the story to Lady Yukin and some of the other gentlewomen. Sei Shōnagon, Makura no Soshi, The Pillow Book, Chapter 130. Ward, when the Empress was staying in the third ward, a palanquin arrived full of irises for the festival of the 5th day, and Her Majesty was presented with herbal balls from the palace. The mistress of the robes and a few of the younger ladies prepared special balls, which they attached to the clothing of the Princess Imperial and of the little prince. Then other very pretty herbal balls arrived from other palaces. Someone also brought a green, wheat cake. I presented it to Her Majesty on the elegant lid of an inkstone, on which I had first spread a sheet of thin green paper carrying the words, "This has come from across the fence." The Empress tore off a piece of the paper and wrote the following splendid poem. "Even on this festive day, when all are seeking butterflies and flowers, you and you alone can see what feelings hide within my heart." Sei Shōnagon, Makura no Soshi, The Pillow Book, Chapter 131. Captain Naranabu has an amazing memory for voices. When several people are conversing, it is usually impossible to tell who is who unless one is very familiar with their manner of speaking. Men in particular have difficulty in recognizing people from their voices or their looks, and it is amazing how Naranabu can identify people even when they are speaking in hushed tones. Sei Shōnagon, Makura no Soshi, The Pillow Book, Chapter 132. I have never come across anyone with such keen ears as Masamitsu, the Minister of the Treasury. I believe he could hear the sound of a mosquito's eyelash falling on the floor. Once during my stay in the west wing of the Empress's office, Masamitsu was in the room when I was having a talk with the new captain of the Inner Palace Guards, the great minister's adopted son. "What do you think about paintings on fans?" murmured someone who was standing near the captain. "Don't answer," I whispered. "That man over there will soon be leaving. Wait until he is gone. My voice was so soft that the captain himself could not hear me. What's that? What's that? He said, straining his ears. Masamitsu, however, clapped his hands and cried, shocking. If you speak about me like that, madam, I shall stay here all day long. Both the captain and I were astounded to realize that Masamitsu had heard what I said. Sei Shōnagon, Makura no Soshi, The Pillow Book, Chapter 133. I hate seeing a dusty, dirty, looking inkstone with an ink stick that has been used in a slovenly way so that it is rubbed down on only one side. It also makes an unpleasant impression if someone puts a cap on a writing brush whose head has become large and shaggy. One can judge a woman's nature by looking at her mirror, her inkstone, or any other belongings of this kind. Nothing gives such a neglected impression as an inlaid inkstone case when dust has collected in cracks at the corners. It is even more important for a man to keep his writing table in perfect order. If his inkstone case is not made in several tiers, it should have 2 fitted boxes, and its gold lacquer design should be attractive without looking contrived. His ink stick, brush, and other equipment should all be chosen to attract attention. Some people seem to think that the actual appearance of their writing utensils is unimportant. They have a box of plain black lacquer with a cracked lid. Into this, they put a tiled inkstone, which is broken on one side and whose every crack is so embedded with dust that one feels that a lifetime would not be long enough to clean it properly. They rub a little ink on the stone, barely blackening the surface, and pour water over it all out of a celadon jug, whose tortoise-shaped spout is broken so that there is only a gaping neck. Yet they are quite content to let people see this unsightly collection of objects. When one takes another person's inkstone to practice some calligraphy or write a letter, it is very unpleasant if the owner says, "Would you mind not using that brush?" One feels awkward if one puts it down at once. Yet to continue writing is sheer impudence. Since people know my views on this matter, they often come to borrow my brush, and I never raise any objection. Sometimes it will be a woman who has a poor hand, yet who always wants to be writing something. She picks up a brush which one has used until it has acquired just the right hardness, and very awkwardly she soaks it in ink. "Is there anything inside this chest?" she asks as she starts scribbling something on the lid. Then she flings one's brush down on its side so that the head is immersed in the ink. Her behavior is hateful, yet how can one bring oneself to tell her so? When one is sitting in front of someone who is writing, it is very unpleasant to be told, "Oh, how dark it is. Please get out of my light." I also find it painful to be scolded by someone when I have been peeping at his calligraphy. This sort of thing does not happen with a man one loves. Sei Shōnagon, Makura no Soshi, The Pillow Book, Chapter 134. Letters are commonplace enough, yet what splendid things they are. When someone is in a distant province and one is worried about him, and then a letter suddenly arrives, one feels as though one were seeing him face to face. Again, it is a great comfort to have expressed one's feelings in a letter even though one knows it cannot yet have arrived. If letters did not exist, what dark depressions would come over one? When one has been worrying about something and wants to tell a certain person about it, what a relief it is to put it all down in a letter. Still greater is one's joy when a reply arrives. At that moment, a letter really seems like an elixir of life. Sei Shōnagon, Makura no Soshi, The Pillow Book, Chapter 135. Furu, Ikuta, Tatsuda, Hanafuchi, and Mikuri. The sacred shrine of the Cryptomeria. It is interesting that this tree should be a sign of virtue. The deity of Kodo, no Mama, deserves the trust that people put in him. I enjoy knowing that this is the shrine, where every prayer's been glibly answered by the god. The deity of Aradoshi. It was past his shrine that Tsurugi was riding when his horse was taken ill, and he was told that this was due to the anger of the god. He then dedicated a poem to the god, whereupon his horse was cured, a delightful incident. I wonder whether the usual explanation for the name Aradoshi is correct. Long ago, there was an emperor who liked only young people, and who ordered that everyone over 40 should be put to death. The older people therefore went and hid in remote provinces, leaving the capital to their juniors. Now there was a captain of the guards, whose parents were both almost 70. They were absolutely terrified, realizing that, if even people of 40 were proscribed, their own position was precarious indeed. The captain, however, a most devoted son, who could not live without seeing his parents at least once a day, refused to let them go off to some distant hiding place. Instead, he spent night after night secretly digging a hole under his house, and when it was finished, he made it into a room where he installed his parents and went to visit them frequently, informing the imperial authorities and everyone else that they had disappeared. Why should His Majesty have decided on this policy? After all, he had no need to concern himself with people who lived quietly at home and minded their own business. Since his son was a captain, I imagine that the father was a high court noble or something of the sort. In any case, he was a very clever, knowing old gentleman, and the captain, despite his youth, was also able and intelligent, so that His Majesty regarded him as the outstanding young man of the day. At this time, the Emperor of China was planning to capture our country by tricking His Majesty, and for this purpose, he was constantly sending puzzles to test His Majesty's ability. On one occasion, he sent a round, glossy, beautifully planed log about 2 feet long and asked, "Which is the base and which is the top?" Since there was absolutely no way of telling, His Majesty was in great distress, so much so that the young captain felt sorry for him and told his father what had happened. "All you need do," said the old man, "is to go to a rapid river, hold the log straight up, and throw it sideways into the water. It will then turn round by itself, and the end that faces downstream will be the top. Mark the wood accordingly and return it to the Chinese emperor." The captain went to the palace, and pretending to have thought of a plan by himself, told His Majesty that he would try to solve the puzzle. Accompanied by a group of people, he proceeded to a river, threw in the log, and made a mark on the end that faced downstream. The log was then sent back, and turned out to be correctly marked. On another occasion, the Chinese emperor sent a pair of identical snakes, each about 2 feet in length, and the test was to tell which was male and which female. Since no one had the faintest idea, the captain again consulted his father, who told him to place the snakes next to each other and to hold a long, straight twig near their tails. "The one that moves its tail," he said, "will be the female." The son followed this advice, and as predicted, one of the snakes remained still while the other one moved. The captain marked them accordingly and sent them back to China. A long time afterwards, the Chinese emperor dispatched to His Majesty a small jewel with 7 curves, and a passage that ran right through all the curves and was open at both ends. "Please pass a thread through the jewel," he wrote. "This is something that everyone in our country knows how to do." Outstanding craftsmen were summoned, but their skill was of no avail. Everyone, from the high court nobles down, admitted defeat. Once more, the captain went to his father. "You must capture 2 large ants," said the old man. "Tie narrow threads round their middles, and attach slightly thicker threads to the ends. Then smear some honey opposite one of the openings, and place the ants at the opposite end." The captain told this to His Majesty, and 2 ants were duly put next to the opening. As soon as they smelt the honey, they started crawling through the passage and rapidly emerged at the other end. The threaded jewel was then returned to China, where it was decided that, after all, the inhabitants of Japan were clever people, and there was no point in sending them any more puzzles. greatly impressed by the captain's achievement. His Majesty asked what he could do for him and what rank he desired. "I want no rank or office at all," declared the young man. "Grant only that all the old people who have gone and hidden themselves be searched out and told that they may safely return to the capital." "That is a simple matter," said the emperor. The old people were delighted when they heard the news, and the captain was appointed great minister. Evidently, the captain's father became a god, for it is said that the deity of Aridoshi appeared in a dream one night to someone who had come on a pilgrimage, and that he recited the following poem. Who is there who does not know that the god of Aridoshi was so named from the passage of the ants through a 7-curved jewel? Sei Shōnagon, Makura no Soshi, The Pillow Book, Chapter 136. Snow. Hail. I do not like sleet, but when it is mixed with pure white snow, it is very pretty. Snow looks wonderful when it has fallen on a roof of cypress bark. When snow begins to melt a little, or when only a small amount has fallen, it enters into all the cracks between the bricks, so that the roof is black in some places, pure white in others, most attractive. I like drizzle and hail when they come down on a shingle roof. I also like frost on a shingle roof or in a garden. Sei Shōnagon, Makura no Soshi, The Pillow Book, Chapter 137. I love white, purple, and black clouds, and rain clouds when they are driven by the wind. It is charming at dawn to see the dark clouds gradually turn white. I believe this has been described in a Chinese poem that says something about the tints that leave at dawn. It is moving to see a thin wisp of cloud across a very bright moon. Sei Shōnagon, Makura no Soshi, The Pillow Book, Chapter 138. Someone who has been serving as a mere maid of honor is appointed to be the nurse of an imperial prince. She no longer bothers with a Chinese jacket or a formal skirt, and weaving a simple white dress, she lies down next to the young prince and stays with him inside his curtained eyes. Summoning her former colleagues, she sends them to her room with messages or gives them letters to deliver. Words do not suffice to describe her behavior. What a splendid thing it is for a subordinate official in the emperor's private office when he is promoted to the rank of chamberlain. One cannot believe that he is the same man who last year in the 11th month had to carry a zither during the special festival. When one sees him walking along in the company of young noblemen, one really wonders where he can have sprung from. This applies also to men who have been given the rank of chamberlain after serving in other offices, but in their case, the change is not quite so impressive. Sei Shōnagon, Makura no Soshi, The Pillow Book, Chapter 139. One day, when the snow lay thick on the ground and was still coming down heavily, I saw some gentlemen of the 4th and 5th ranks who had a fresh complexion and a pleasant, youthful look. Their beautifully colored court robes, which they wore over their night-watch costumes, were tucked up at the bottom and showed the marks of their leather belts. Their dark purple trousers stood out beautifully against the white snow. I could also see their underjackets, some of scarlet, others dyed a beautiful rose yellow. The men had opened their umbrellas, but since it was very windy, the snow came at them from the side, and they bent forward slightly as they walked. The sparkling white snow covered them all the way to the tips of their lacquered leather shoes or short clogs, a magnificent sight. Sei Shōnagon, Makura no Soshi, The Pillow Book, Chapter 140. Towards the end of the 8th month, I was on my way to the temple at Uzumasa when I saw a crowd of peasants working in the fields. The ears of rice had started to grow out, and the men were busily reaping the plants. True indeed were the poet's words when he wrote, "They were pulling out the sprouts." Now already autumn has stolen up. Yes, it was only the other day that I had seen them planting the fields as I set out on a pilgrimage for Kamo, and it was already time for the harvest. On this occasion, all the workers were men. Bending down, they pulled out the plants, seized them by their green roots with one hand, and cut off the ears with a knife or something of the sort held in their other hand. They seemed to work with such ease that I really felt like including their skill among impressive things. How on earth did they manage it? I was fascinated to observe how they put all the plants together in bundles with the bright red ears on top. The huts inhabited by these peasants looked most peculiar. Sei Shōnagon, Makura no Soshi, The Pillow Book, Chapter 141. Shortly after the 20th of the 9th month, I went on a pilgrimage to Heise Temple and spent the night in a very simple lodging. Being exhausted, I fell at once into a sound sleep. When I woke up late at night, the moonlight was pouring in through the window and shining on the bed, clothes of all the other people in the room. Its clear white brilliance moved me greatly. It is on such occasions that people write poems. Sei Shōnagon, Makura no Soshi, The Pillow Book, Chapter 142. A family has finally arranged the marriage of their daughter, but the new son-in-law stops visiting his wife. Then one day he runs into his father-in-law in a public place. Surely the young man cannot help feeling rather sorry for his wife and her family. A certain young man, who had been adopted as son-in-law by a very powerful family, ended by neglecting his wife for months at a time. The wife's nurse and others called ill luck down on his head, and all the household spoke strongly against him. In the first month of the following year, however, he was appointed chamberlain. "This is really going to surprise everyone," people said. How on earth could he get the promotion when he is on such bad terms with his wife's family? Reports of this gossip must certainly have reached his ears. In the 6th month, the young chamberlain, elegantly attired in trousers of silk damask, a glossy white robe lined, with dark red and a short-sleeved black jacket, was among the crowd of people who attended a recitation of the 8 lessons. It so happened that his carriage was standing close to that of the girl whom he had forsaken, so close, in fact, that he could have hung the cord of his jacket over the kite's tail of her carriage. "I wonder how she will take it," said one of the ladies in the girl's suite, and they all felt very sorry for her. Yet the young man evidently did not care in the slightest about his wife's pathetic situation or about what people were thinking, for afterwards it was reported that he had sat in his carriage with an expression of complete indifference. Sei Shōnagon, Makura no Soshi, The Pillow Book, Chapter 143. To feel that one is disliked by others is surely one of the saddest things in the world, and no one, however foolish, could wish such a thing on himself. Yet everywhere, whether it be in the palace or at home in the bosom of the family, there are some people who are naturally liked and others who are not. Not only among people of good birth, where it goes without saying, but even among commoners, children who are adored by their parents naturally attract the attention of outsiders, and everyone makes a great fuss over them. If they are attractive children, it is only natural that their parents should dote on them. How could it be otherwise? But if the children have nothing particular to recommend them, one can only assume that such devotion comes merely from the fact of being parents. I imagine that there can be nothing so delightful as to be loved by everyone, one's parents, one's master, and all the people with whom one is on close terms. Sei Shōnagon, Makura no Soshi, The Pillow Book, Chapter 144. Men really have strange emotions, and behave in the most bizarre ways. Sometimes, a man will leave a very pretty woman to marry an ugly one. Surely a gentleman who frequents the palace should choose as his love the prettiest girl of good family he can find. Though she may be of such high standing that he cannot hope to make her his wife, he should, if he is really impressed by the girl, languish for her unto death. Sometimes, too, a man will become so fascinated by a girl of whom he has heard favorable reports that he will do everything in his power to marry her, even though they have never even met. I do not understand how a man can possibly love a girl whom other people, even those of her own sex, find ugly. I remember a certain woman who was both attractive and good-natured, and who furthermore had excellent handwriting. Yet when she sent a beautifully written poem to the man of her choice, he replied with some pretentious jottings and did not even bother to visit her. She wept endearingly, but he was indifferent and went to see another woman instead. Everyone, even people who were not directly concerned, felt indignant about this callous behavior, and the woman's family was much grieved. The man himself, however, showed not the slightest pity. Sei Shōnagon, Makura no Soshi, The Pillow Book, Chapter 145. Sympathy is the most splendid of all qualities. This is especially true when it is found in men, but it also applies to women. Compassionate remarks of the type, "How sad for you," to someone who has suffered a misfortune, or "I can imagine what he must be feeling about a man who has had some sorrow," are bound to give pleasure, however casual and perfunctory they may be. If one's remark is addressed to someone else and repeated to the sufferer, it is even more effective than if one makes it directly. The unhappy person will never forget one's kindness and will be anxious to let one know how it has moved him. If it is someone who is close to one and who expects sympathetic inquiries, he will not be especially pleased since he is merely receiving his due. But a friendly remark passed on to less intimate people is certain to give pleasure. This all sounds simple enough, yet hardly anyone seems to bother. Altogether, it seems as if men and women with good heads rarely have good hearts. Yet I suppose there must be some who are both clever and kind. Sei Shōnagon, Makura no Soshi, The Pillow Book, Chapter 146. It is absurd of people to get angry because one has gossiped about them. How can anyone be so simple as to believe that he is free to find fault with others, while his own foibles are passed over in silence? Yet when someone hears that he has been discussed unfavorably, he is always outraged, and this I find most unattractive. If I am really close to someone, I realize that it would be hurting to speak badly about him, and when the opportunity for gossip arises, I hold my peace. In all other cases, however, I freely speak my mind and make everyone laugh. Sei Shōnagon, Makura no Soshi, The Pillow Book, Chapter 147. Features that I particularly like in someone's face continue to give a thrill of delight, however often I see the person. With pictures it is different. If I look at them too often, they cease to attract me. Indeed, I never so much as glance at the beautiful paintings on the screen that stands near my usual seat. There is something really fascinating about beautiful faces. Though an object such as a vase or a fan may be ugly in general, there is always one particular part that one can gaze at with pleasure. One would expect this to apply to faces also, but alas, there is nothing to recommend an ugly face. Sei Shōnagon, Makura no Soshi, The Pillow Book, Chapter 148. Finding a large number of tales that one has not read before, or acquiring the second volume of a tale whose first volume one has enjoyed. But often it is a disappointment. Someone has torn up a letter and thrown it away. Picking up the pieces, one finds that many of them can be fitted together. One has had an upsetting dream and wonders what it can mean. In great anxiety, one consults a dream interpreter, who informs one that it has no special significance. A person of quality is holding forth about something in the past or about a recent event that is being widely discussed. Several people are gathered round him, but it is oneself that he keeps looking at as he talks. A person who is very dear to one has fallen ill. One is miserably worried about him, even if he lives in the capital, and far more so if he is in some remote part of the country. What a pleasure to be told that he has recovered. I am most pleased when I hear someone I love being praised or being mentioned approvingly by an important person. A poem that someone has composed for a special occasion or written to another person in reply is widely praised and copied by people in their notebooks. Though this is something that has never yet happened to me, I can imagine how pleasing it must be. A person with whom one is not especially intimate refers to an old poem or story that is unfamiliar. Then one hears it being mentioned by someone else, and one has the pleasure of recognizing it. Still later, when one comes across it in a book, one thinks, "Ah, this is it," and feels delighted with the person who first brought it up. I feel very pleased when I have acquired some Michinoku paper, or some white, decorated paper, or even plain paper if it is nice and white. A person in whose company one feels awkward asks one to supply the opening or closing line of a poem. If one happens to recall it, one is very pleased. Yet often on such occasions, one completely forgets something that one would normally know. I look for an object that I need at once, and I find it. Or again, there is a book that I must see immediately. I turn everything upside down, and there it is. What a joy. When one is competing in an object match, it does not matter what kind. How can one help being pleased at winning? I greatly enjoy taking in someone who is pleased with himself and who has a self-confident look, especially if he is a man. It is amusing to observe him as he alertly waits for my next repartee. But it is also interesting if he tries to put me off my guard by adopting an air of calm indifference, as if there were not a thought in his head. I realize that it is very sinful of me, but I cannot help being pleased when someone I dislike has a bad experience. It is a great pleasure when the ornamental comb that one has ordered turns out to be pretty. I am more pleased when something nice happens to a person I love than when it happens to myself. Entering the Empress's room and finding that ladies in waiting are crowded round her in a tight group, I go next to a pillar which is some distance from where she is sitting. What a delight it is when Her Majesty summons me to her side, so that all the others have to make way. Sei Shōnagon, Makura no Soshi, The Pillow Book, Chapter 149. One day, when Her Majesty was surrounded by several ladies, I remarked in connection with something that she had said. There are times when the world so exasperates me that I feel I cannot go on living in it for another moment, and I want to disappear for good. But then, if I happen to obtain some nice white paper, Michinoku paper, or white decorated paper, I decide that I can put up with things as they are a little longer. Or if I can spread out a finely woven green straw mat and examine the white bordering with its vivid black patterns, I somehow feel that I cannot turn my back on this world, and life actually seems precious to me. It really doesn't take much to console you, said the Empress, laughing. I wonder what sort of a person it was who gazed at the moon on Mount Obasut. The ladies who were in attendance also teased me. You've certainly found a cheap prayer for warding off evil, they said. Some time later, when I was staying at home and absorbed in various petty worries, a messenger brought me 20 rolls of magnificent paper from Her Majesty. Come back quickly, she wrote, adding, I am sending you this because of what you told me the other day. It seems to be of poor quality, however, and I am afraid you will not be able to use it for copying the Sutra of Longevity. It delighted me that Her Majesty should have remembered something that I myself had completely forgotten. Even if an ordinary person had sent me the present, I should have been overjoyed. How much more pleasing when it came from the Empress herself. I was so excited that I could not frame a proper reply, but simply sent Her Majesty this poem. Thanks to the paper that the goddess gave, my years will now be plenteous as the cranes. Make sure that the Empress is asked the following, I told the messenger. Am I expecting too many years? My reward for the messenger, a general maid from the table room, was an unlined green costume. Then I immediately used the paper I had received to write my collection of notes. I felt a glow of delight, and all my worries began to disappear. A couple of days later, a messenger, dressed in red, arrived with a straw mat. Here you are, he said. And who may you be? Said my maid severely. Such impudence. However, the man simply put down the mat and left. I told the maid to ask him where he came from, but he had already disappeared. She brought me the mat, which was an unusually beautiful one with a splendid white border, of the type used by high dignitaries. I felt it must be the Empress who had sent it, but as I was not quite sure, I told someone to look for the messenger. Everyone was greatly puzzled, but I did not think the matter was worth discussing, since the messenger was nowhere to be found. It occurred to me that, if he had delivered the mat to the wrong place, he would be sure to come back and say so. I should have liked to send someone to Her Majesty's palace to discover the truth of the affair. Then I decided that the mystery must be deliberate, and that the mat could only have come from the Empress. This thought filled me with joy. Having heard nothing further after 2 days, I knew there could be no doubt about the matter, and I sent a message to Lady Sakyo telling her what had happened. Has any of this come to your ears? I asked. Please inform me secretly of what you have heard. In any case, do not let anyone know that I have asked you. Her Majesty did it all in great secret, was Lady Sakyo's reply. On no account tell anyone now or later that I informed you. Delighted that everything I had suspected was now clear, I wrote a letter, telling the messenger to lay it on the balustrade in Her Majesty's palace when no one was looking. In his nervousness, however, he placed it in such a way that it fell off the side and landed under the stairs. Sei Shōnagon, Makura no Soshi, The Pillow Book, Chapter 150. On about the 20th of the second month, His Excellency the Chancellor ordered that a dedication of the full canon of the sutras take place in the temple, known as Shakyuzen in Hoko Palace. It was arranged that Her Majesty should attend the service as well as the Empress Dowager, and on the 1st of the month, she proceeded to the palace of the Second Ward. It was late at night when we arrived, and since I was tired, I went directly to bed. When I got up the next morning, the sun was shining brightly, and I noticed that everything in the palace was spick and span, beginning with the bamboo blinds, which looked as if they had only been hung on the previous day. I was delighted by all I saw, and wondered when they had managed to decorate the rooms so elegantly, and to install the lion and the Korean dog. At the foot of the stairs leading into the garden, there was a cherry tree covered with what appeared to be magnificent blossoms. I was surprised that it should have bloomed so early, and it occurred to me that, if the cherry was already out, the plum trees must be at their height. Then I realized that the flowers were artificial. Their tint, however, was in no way inferior to that of real blossoms. What skill must have been needed to make them look so lifelike? It saddened me to think that they would all be ruined if it started to rain. The palace had been constructed on a site previously occupied by several small houses, and the trees in the garden did not show to full advantage. The building itself, however, had an immediate appeal. In the morning, His Excellency, the Chancellor, arrived to call on the Empress. He was wearing bluish, gray trousers of heavily figured silk and a cherry blossom cloak over 3 scarlet robes. The Empress and the other ladies were dressed in the most splendid costumes made of glossy, plum blossom material, some with heavily figured designs, others decorated with embroidery. On top, they wore Chinese jackets of light green, willow green, or red plum blossom. Watching the Chancellor as he sat down in front of the Empress and started talking to her, I wished that I could somehow arrange to let outsiders have a glimpse of the scene, so that they might observe how perfectly she made her replies. "What more could your Majesty desire?" said the Chancellor, looking towards the Empress's ladies in waiting. "Really, I can't help feeling envious when I see all these splendid women seated round you side by side. There's not a single one of them who is not well born. Oh, how magnificent to be attended by such ladies. I hope you're kind to them. If they knew what you were really like, I doubt whether they would crowd into your service as they do. Despite your shamefully mean nature, I have served you loyally since you were born. And never once have you given me so much as a piece of cast, off clothing. Yes, I might as well tell you openly what I think." We were all greatly amused and burst out laughing. "I'm being quite serious," said the Chancellor. "How dare you laugh at me?" Several of the women gathered to talk about the costumes and fans they would use on the day of the ceremony, each being determined to outdo the others in elegance. In the midst of the discussion, however, one of them exclaimed, "Why should I take so much trouble? I shall simply appear as I am." "Oh dear, there she goes again," said the others in a rather spiteful tone. In the evenings, many of the ladies in waiting went home to make their preparations for the great event. Under the circumstances, Her Majesty could not very well stop them from leaving the palace. The Chancellor's wife called on the Empress every day, and even at night. His Excellency's young daughters also paid regular visits, and a messenger came daily from the imperial palace. In fact, the Empress was surrounded by people, and it was all very pleasant. As the days went by, the condition of the cherry blossoms in front of the palace did not improve, and the sun gave them an unpleasant, withered look. One morning, after it had rained all night, I got up early and went into the garden. By this time, the blossoms were really not worth looking at, and I remarked that they could hardly be compared to the faces of tearful lovers forced to say farewell. Her Majesty overheard me. "What's happened to them?" she said in surprise. "I know it was raining last night." Just then, a crowd of attendants and servants arrived from the Chancellor's residence. They rushed up to the tree and tore down all the blossoms. His Excellency said we should remove them while it was still dark so that no one would see us, I heard one of the attendants say. "The sun's already out, and it's going to be awkward. Come on. We'd better do it quickly." I was most amused, and if they had been people of quality, I should have liked to ask them whether they had thought of Yumi's poem, "Let him tell me what he will." Instead, I simply inquired who they were, and said they had no right to steal the blossoms. The men ran away with much laughter, gathering speed as they went and dragging the branches behind them. After they had gone, I realized that the Chancellor's idea had been a very happy one indeed. After all, what pleasure would there have been in seeing a mass of wet blossoms coiled round the tree and sticking to the branches? Then I went back inside the palace. Presently, a man arrived from the housekeeping office to open the lattices, and some women from the Office of Grounds came to clean the rooms. When they had finished, Her Majesty got up. She noticed at once that the blossoms had disappeared. "Oh dear," she said. "Where have they all gone? I heard you say something about thieves earlier this morning, but I thought they had taken only a few of the branches." "Did you see who they were?" "No, Your Majesty," I replied. It was still too dark to see anything properly. I could only make out some white forms moving about in the garden. I thought they might be stealing the blossoms, so I called out to them. "All the same," said the Empress with a laugh, "why should anyone want to steal cherry blossoms? I am sure it must have been His Excellency who ordered some of his men to remove the branches secretly." "Oh no," said I, "that doesn't seem at all likely. It must have been the spring breeze." "If you go on speaking like that," said the Empress, "it means you have something to hide. No one has stolen those blossoms. It was the spring rain." One could hardly be surprised that Her Majesty should have guessed the truth, yet I was greatly impressed. Since the Chancellor was about to arrive, I withdrew into the back of the room, knowing that he would find my disheveled, mourning face extremely unseasonal. As soon as he entered, I heard him explain in a surprised tone, "Good heavens! The blossoms have disappeared. How could you let them be stolen? What sleepyheads you all are not to have noticed it. And yet," I murmured, "you must certainly have known about the theft before I did." He caught my words instantly. "Ah," he said, laughing loudly, "so you knew about it." I expected as much. Most people who went into the garden wouldn't have seen that anything was missing. I was sure that, if anyone noticed, it would be you or Sei Shōnagon. "Yes," said the Empress with a charming smile, "Shonagon knew who was responsible." But she pretended to believe that it was the spring breeze. "And you, sir, have been telling us a lie." Then in the most elegant way imaginable she recited the lines, "The time must now have come till the rice fields in the hills." "How extremely annoying of my men to let themselves be seen," said the Chancellor. "I particularly told them to be careful. It really is a misery to have such fools in one's service, but it was a very pleasant idea of Shonagon's to have invented the spring breeze." And he recited a few words from the poem about the rice fields. "Yes, indeed," said the Empress. "It was quite ingenious of Shonagon, considering that it was only a simple remark." Then she added with a smile, "I can't help wondering what it must have been like to see those men stealing the flowers this morning." "Shonagon understood everything from the beginning," said the counselor's little boy. "It was she who pointed out how sad it would be if the blossoms were drenched by the rain." I was amused to see how annoyed the Chancellor looked when he heard this. Towards the 9th of the month, I announced that I was returning home. "Don't go yet," said the Empress. "Wait until the ceremony is a little nearer." But I left the palace all the same. Then, at about noon on an unusually calm, sunny day, I received the following message from Her Majesty. "Have the flowers laid bare their hearts. You must not fail to let me know." "It would be premature to speak of autumn," I replied, "yet I feel myself ascending 9 times towards you in the night." On the evening when the Empress set out for the smaller palace of the second ward, no arrangements had been made about the seating in the carriages, and each of the women rushed to secure a place for herself. I and 3 of the more important ladies, waiting, stood watching this unpleasant scene. "What a chaotic way of getting into carriages," I said, laughing. "It's as bad as the return procession. They're all in such a state that they look as if they might collapse at any moment. Well, it can't be helped. If there's no room for us in these carriages, Her Majesty is bound to hear why we haven't reached the second ward, and she'll send another for us." When all the other women had pushed themselves into the carriages, a gentleman from the office of the Empress's household asked whether anyone was left. "Yes," I replied, "we're still here." He came up and asked our names. "Very strange," he exclaimed when we had told him. "I thought that everyone had found a place by now. Why are you ladies so late?" "We were on the point of putting the serving women into this last carriage." "Really, I find your behavior most peculiar." He ordered that a carriage be pulled up. "If that's how it is," I said, "put the servants in first as you planned, and we can go later." "Outrageous," said the gentleman. "What an unpleasant nature you have." The other ladies and I then stepped into the carriage that had been intended for the serving women. We laughed to see how dark it was inside. When we reached the palace in the second ward, we found that the Empress's palanquin had arrived early and that everything had been arranged for her. Since Her Majesty had ordered that I be brought into her presence as soon as I arrived, Ukyo, Kasakin, and some of the other young ladies had been examining each of the carriages, but there had been no sign of me. The passengers went to the Empress's room in groups of 4 and gathered round her. "How odd," she exclaimed after some time. "Why is Shonagon not among you?" No one could answer. When the last carriage was drawn up outside the palace, the young ladies finally saw me. "Why are you so late?" they said. "Her Majesty hasn't stopped asking about you." As they led me into her presence, I looked about the palace and was greatly impressed. It was amazing that, in such a short time, things could have been arranged to look as if the Empress had lived there for years. "Why didn't you come sooner?" said Her Majesty when she saw me. "I've been asking everyone about you." As I did not answer, the ladies who had traveled with me laughed loudly and said, "It really couldn't be helped, Your Majesty. People who travel last can't very well arrive early." As it was, we almost missed that last carriage, but the serving women took pity on us and let us use it. And what a dark, wretched carriage it was. "I am rather surprised at the man who was in charge of the traveling arrangements," said the Empress. "Why didn't you say something? I can see that those of you who are unfamiliar with these things might hesitate to speak, but surely one of you, Yumo for instance, could have tried to help." "But, Your Majesty," said Yumo, "why did they all have to push ahead of each other like that?" It occurred to me how unpleasant it must be for the ladies who were standing nearby to hear this. "Indeed," said Her Majesty with a look of annoyance, "I see no excuse for such undignified behavior. The seating arrangements should have been carefully planned in advance." "I'm sure it was my fault," I said, trying to smooth things over. I took a long time coming from my room, and that made them all very impatient. Hearing that on the following day Her Majesty would be attending the recitation of the newly dedicated sutras, I went to visit her in her room in the evening. On my way, I looked into the hall at the northern end of the southern palace. Several lamps were standing on trays, and by their light, I could see that the room was full of women. Some were seated behind screens in small groups of 3 or 4. Others had retired alone behind curtains of state. Still others had gathered to make their toilet, to attach the cords to their formal skirts, or to sew their robes, which they had arranged in piles on the floor. As I observed them elaborately arranging their hair, it occurred to me that I would probably never again see anything as splendid as the next day's ceremony. "I understand that Her Majesty is to set out tomorrow morning at the hour of the tiger," said one of the ladies, in waiting when she saw me. "And why didn't you come until now?" "Someone sent you a fan with a message to ask what you were doing." I had already put on my full ceremonial robes so that I might be ready in case the Empress did leave as early as the hour of the tiger, but the sun rose and there was still no sign of her. Then, hearing that the carriages were to be brought up to the western wing of the palace, near the part of the hall that was covered by Chinese eaves, we all went out to the corridor. The ladies, in waiting who had recently come into service and were unaccustomed to ceremonies of this kind, looked very nervous. Her Majesty now proceeded to the western wing, where the Chancellor was residing, and together with 5 other ladies, Lady Shaijisha, the Chancellor's 3rd and 4th daughters, the Chancellor's wife and his sister-in-law, she seated herself behind some blinds to watch us getting into the carriages. As each carriage arrived at the entrance, the Major Counselor and the middle captain of the 3rd rank, one on either side, rolled up the outer and inner blinds and helped the ladies. If we had all been able to stay closely together, we should not have been so conspicuous. But as it was, our names were called out individually from a list, and we had to go forward in groups of 4. Presently my turn came, and I walked towards the carriage that had been assigned to me. To say that I was terribly uncomfortable would be an understatement. The thought of the Empress watching me from behind the blinds and possibly thinking that I was ugly made me so miserable that I started perspiring and felt that my beautifully arranged hair was standing on end. When I had finally managed to get past the blinds and came close to the carriage, I saw to my extreme embarrassment that two handsome young gentlemen, the counselor and the captain, were standing by the entrance, smiling broadly. It was just like a dream. Nevertheless, I managed to reach the carriage without collapsing. I am afraid I cannot have cut a very fine figure, but I did my best. When we had all got into our carriages, they were pulled out into the 2nd Avenue and left there, with the shafts resting on the trestles. They looked splendid, standing one behind the other as on the occasion of some grand festival, and I felt my heart pounding at the thought that the onlookers must be as impressed as I was. Several men of the 4th, 5th, and 6th ranks strolled up to the carriages and addressed elegant remarks to the ladies inside. The Chancellor, in company with all the senior courtiers and many other gentlemen, now came out to greet the Empress Dowager. Since Her Majesty's palanquin was not to leave until the Empress Dowager had passed the palace, I expected that there would be a tiresome wait, but it was not long before the procession arrived. There were 15 carriages in all, with the Empress Dowager's Chinese style carriage in front, followed by 4 that were occupied by nuns. Through the back entrances, one could see the nuns, crystal rosaries, gray stoles, and other vestments. The blinds were still lowered, but I could make out the light violet color of the inner hangings, which were a slightly darker shade towards the edges. In the remaining 10 carriages sat ladies, in waiting, elegantly dressed in Chinese jackets of cherry, blossom material, skirts of scarlet or occasionally light violet, and coats of stiff silk. Though there was a bright sun, the sky was covered with mist, giving a pale green effect. Against this light, the colors of the ladies' court robes made a splendid combination, even surpassing in elegance the varied designs of their Chinese jackets. The Chancellor, his younger brother, and the other gentlemen of his suite now came out to pay their respects to the Empress Dowager. It was a magnificent sight, and we were all wild with admiration. No doubt the men for their part were impressed by our 20 carriages, which stood in a row along the avenue. Her Majesty's palanquin had still not left, and I was becoming impatient. Finally, 8 palace girls were led up on horseback, wearing blue formal skirts shaded darker towards the edges, waistband ribbons, and shoulder sashes, which all fluttered attractively in the breeze. One of the girls, called Buzin, was on intimate terms with Shijmasa, the doctor. Noticing that she had on a pair of grape-colored trousers, Yamanoi, the major counselor, laughed and said, "So they have allowed Shijmasa to wear the forbidden color." The row of horses on which the palace girls were riding came to a halt, and just then the Empress's palanquin appeared. The Empress Dowager's retinue had seemed splendid enough, but it was as nothing compared to this new sight. By now the sun was high in the sky, making the onion flower decoration, the glossy curtains, and everything else glitter brilliantly. The attendants pulled the cords, and the palanquin moved off. As the ladies watched its curtains swaying gently with the motion, they were so impressed that their hair literally stood on end. Later, even those who had been most beautifully groomed complained how messy their hair had become. It was indeed a fantastically impressive moment, and I too was overcome with awe, wondering how it was possible that I should be in daily attendance on such a magnificent empress. After the palanquin had passed, the attendants came forward and yoked the oxen to our carriages. We then started moving along the avenue behind the empress, our hearts full of the most inexpressible joy and pride. When Her Majesty reached Shakyusan Temple, a group of musicians by the great outer gate played Korean and Chinese music, and there were performances of the lion dance and the dance of the Korean dog. So loud was the sound of the 13 pipe flute and the tabor that I became quite giddy. I wondered to which of the Buddha's realms I had been wafted and felt that I was floating up into the sky with the music. Presently, the procession entered the temple enclosure, where I saw numerous pavilions with brocade curtains, closed off by bright green blinds and surrounded by hangings. It was all so splendid that I could not believe we were still in this world of ours. Our carriages were pulled up before the Empress's gallery, where the major counselor and the captain, who were still on duty, asked us to get out as quickly as possible. I had been embarrassed enough when stepping into the carriage, but here things were still more awkward, since it was brighter and we were more exposed than we had been at the palace. Nevertheless, I was able to cast an admiring glance at Korchika, the major counselor, as he stood there looking imposingly handsome in an robe whose train seemed far too long for such a narrow place. Raising the carriage blinds, he told us to make haste. I felt that the artificial locks, which I had tucked together with my own hair under my Chinese jacket, were in disorder and must look very strange. It was so light in the temple enclosure that one could easily distinguish the shades of blackness and redness in our hair. All this made me extremely embarrassed, and at first I could not bring myself to step out of the carriage. "Please get out before me," I asked the lady who was sitting in the back. But evidently she was just as shy as I, for she turned to the major counselor, who was standing directly outside the carriage, and said, "Would you be so good as to step back a little? You are too kind to us. How timid you ladies are," he remarked with a laugh as he stepped back a few paces. Since we still hesitated, he again walked up to us. "It was Her Majesty who told me to come," he explained. "She said I should get you out of the carriages in such a way that people like Munetaka would not see you. That's the only reason I'm here." He then helped us out of the carriage and led us to the Empress. I felt very grateful to her for having given these instructions on our behalf. As I approached the Empress, I noticed that about 8 ladies who had traveled in the first carriages were installed at the edge of the veranda, from where they could have a good view of the ceremony. Her Majesty was seated on a platform about 2 feet high. "I have brought you Shonagon and the others," announced Korchika, and I did not let anyone get a look at them. The Empress said she wanted to see us and emerged from her curtain of state. She had not changed her clothes since I saw her before and was still wearing the same Chinese jacket, but she was dazzlingly beautiful. Where else would one ever see a red Chinese robe like this? Beneath it, she wore a willow green robe of Chinese damask, 5 layers of unlined robes of grape-colored silk, a robe of Chinese gauze with blue prints over a plain white background, and a ceremonial skirt of elephant, eye silk. I felt that nothing in the world could compare with the beauty of these colors. "How do I look today?" Her Majesty asked me. "Magnificent," I replied, realizing at once how inadequate a response this was. "I am afraid you must have become rather impatient waiting for my palanquin," she said. We were delayed by the master of the household. He was afraid that if people saw him accompanying me in the same robe that he had worn when he was with the Empress Dowager, there might be some criticism. So he ordered his women to sew a new robe, and that is why we were so late. What a taste he has for elegance. It was very bright on the gallery, and I could see Her Majesty's hair more closely than usual. I was absolutely fascinated by the beauty of her front parting, which was combed at a slight angle pointing towards the ornament that held up the hair over her forehead. A pair of 3-foot curtains of state had been placed together in such a way that I was separated from the other ladies. A mat had been spread behind the curtains, its borders parallel to the lower beam of the gallery. On it were seated Lady Shonagon, the daughter of Captain Tadajimi, the Chancellor's uncle, and Lady Sei Shōnagon, the granddaughter of the Minister of the Right. "Please go to the gentlemen's hall," said the Empress to Lady Sei Shōnagon, "and see what is happening." Sei Shōnagon, however, realized what Her Majesty had in mind. "Surely there is enough room for all 3 of us to sit here and have a good view," she said. "Very well then," said the Empress. She summoned me to come closer and sit on the mat. Seeing this, One of the ladies in waiting who was seated on a lower level laughingly remarked that I was just like a page, boy who had been given special permission to enter the senior courtier's chamber. "I wonder if Her Majesty is trying to be funny," said a second lady, and still another commented that my position was more like that of a mounted escort. Despite their quips, I was delighted by the honor of sitting beside Her Majesty to watch the ceremony. I suppose this sounds rather conceited, yet how can I remain silent about something that really happened? Of course, I was treated far too kindly, and no doubt many knowing people of the type who are always ready to find fault with others maliciously blamed our gracious Empress for her indiscretion in befriending someone like me. And it is true that I was favored in a way that a woman in my position does not deserve. From where I was sitting, I had a splendid view of the galleries occupied by the Empress Dowager and the other important people. His Excellency, the Chancellor, now started a round of visits, going first to the gallery of the Empress Dowager, where he stayed for a while, and then coming to us. The two major counselors and the captain of the third rank had already arrived. The captain was still wearing his guard's uniform with a bow and quiver at his waist, which suited the occasion admirably. A large group of senior courtiers and other gentlemen of the fourth and fifth ranks, whom he had brought along as an escort, sat in a row next to him. As the Chancellor entered Her Majesty's gallery, he looked round at the occupants. The ladies in waiting, including Madame, the mistress of the robes, were all dressed in Chinese jackets and formal skirts with trains. Her Excellency, the Chancellor's wife, wore a wide-sleeved court robe over her skirt. "Ah," exclaimed the Chancellor, "you look like something out of a picture. But please, don't go about later saying that you were uncomfortable today in your stiff clothes. And you, my girls," he added, turning to his third and fourth daughters, "be ready to help Her Majesty off with her formal skirt and train. Remember that she is the mistress of you all. It is in front of her gallery that the guards have been ordered to take up their positions. Do you suppose everyone has such an honor?" Then he burst into tears. Everyone who saw him thought that he had good reason to weep, and they themselves felt tears coming to their eyes. When the Chancellor noticed that my Chinese jacket was made of red silk with 5 patterns embroidered in cherry-colored thread, he laughed and said, "We've suddenly found ourselves short of a red robe for one of the priests. I wish we could borrow that jacket of yours. It looks exactly like a clerical vestment. In any case, I'm sure you made it by shortening a priest's robe." "Yes," said Korchika, who had moved towards the rear of the gallery, "it must be the robe of Bishop Sei." Bishop Ryuan wore a robe of thin, red material, a purple stole, a light mauve jacket, and a pair of loose trousers. The bluish tint of his shaved head made him look very attractive, and one could easily have taken him for the Bodhisattva Jizo. It was funny to see him surrounded by ladies in waiting. "How unpleasant for him to be among the women," someone said with a laugh. "I'm sure he'd prefer to be walking along solemnly with all those priestly dignitaries." Matsujimi, who had accompanied his father, was brought to see us. He wore a grape-colored court cloak, a dark violet robe of beaten damask, and a jacket of plum red material. Escorted by the usual crowd of gentlemen of the fourth and fifth ranks, he was led into the midst of the ladies in the Empress's gallery. Then something went wrong, and he started to cry loudly, but even this was very charming. The ceremony began. Texts of the full canon were placed on red lotus flowers, one scroll on each petal, and carried by a procession of clerics, high court nobles, senior courtiers, gentlemen of the sixth rank, and many other gentlemen. It was most awe-inspiring. Next came the great procession round the holy image, and then the officiating priest appeared and recited the prayer for salvation. Later, there was a performance of dances. After I had watched these ceremonies all day long, my eyes were aching. Towards evening, a chamberlain of the fifth rank arrived with a letter for the Empress from the palace. A stool was brought out for him and placed in front of the gallery. As he sat there waiting for Her Majesty's reply, the chamberlain made a very splendid sight. The next gentleman to arrive was Norimasa, the secretary in the Ministry of Ceremonial. Her Majesty is to return to the palace this evening, he announced, and I have been ordered to escort her. This is an imperial command. Norimasa then remained in the gallery, waiting for the Empress to leave. First, I must go to the palace in the second ward, she said. Just then the chamberlain, controller, brought an imperial message for the chancellor, who, after reading it, told his daughter that she must do exactly what His Majesty desired. The Empress then made preparations to return directly to the imperial palace. Meanwhile, attendants also brought Her Majesty some charming gifts and a note from the Empress Dowager, who referred to the salt, kilns of Chica, and the like. When the ceremony was over, the Empress Dowager left, but now she was escorted by only about one-half of the high court nobles and household officials who had accompanied her on her arrival. The servants of the Empress's ladies in waiting had not been informed that Her Majesty was returning to the imperial palace, and in the evening they all went to the residence in the second ward, where they stayed until late at night waiting for their mistresses. Meanwhile, in the palace, the ladies were waiting for their maids to bring them their night clothes. They felt extremely cold in their elegant ceremonial robes, to which they were unaccustomed, and they spoke furiously, but of course to no avail, about their servants. "How could you be so stupid?" they asked when they finally arrived on the following morning, but they had to agree that their maid's explanation was entirely reasonable. On the day after the ceremony, it started raining. "This shows what a good karma I must have," the chancellor told the Empress. "Don't you agree?" One could well understand why he was so relieved.